In the Mood by Glenn Miller topped the charts in the early 1940s, and this song displayed the attitude of Americans after World War II. The Americans were in the mood to dance and celebrate after their victory over Japan and the Axis powers. The average American felt that their duty and obligation to Europe was over, and that there was no need to go back. The Allies, led by the Americans and British, enjoyed heroic victory over the Axis powers of Central Europe, but Europe was now in economic turmoil. After the invasion of D-Day, the ground battle in Western and Central Europe left the countryside and city blocks in total ruin. If Europe was left to their own devices, it would have taken decades to recover, and during that time, the colossus to the east, the Soviet Union, would have consumed most of Europe and turned the countries into communist states. If they were not helped soon, Europe would be lost. Every major industry in Europe was bankrupt, including steel, coal, and cement, and especially the agrarian companies were hit the hardest. All were bankrupt, and because of American tariffs, the European markets were unable to compete. At the same time, one man was trying to help, Secretary of State George C. Marshall. He was the spokesman for a group of brilliant economists, financiers, and investment bankers trying to come up with a plan to save Europe, the Marshall Plan. The first mention of the plan was to a group of graduating Harvard students, the class of 1947. Mr. Malcolm Crawford, a graduate student studying international law and diplomacy at Harvard, was working on his master thesis concerning European recovery entitled A Blueprint for the Financing Post-War Business Industry in the United Kingdom and the Republic of France. The thesis was read by the future Supreme Court Justice Abe Fortas and presented to President Truman, who knew that this college student had figured out a solution for helping Europe. The original idea of the Marshall Plan was to send money over to Europe, and then to send any material aid that the American government could afford. However, because of war debts of our own, that was very little. General Marshall was having a difficult time convincing Congress to start his plan, and he knew that Europe needed aid, and quickly. It was Malcolm Crawford, a farm boy from Kentucky, who wrote his master thesis on incorporating the American businessman into the recovery of Europe, that the plan had potential. Soon Mr. Crawford was introduced to Under-Secretary of State Dean Acheson as the boy who knew more about the Marshall Plan than General Marshall. Mr. Crawford presented his idea of using the American businessman to help Europe recovery, and that made the plan possible. When General Marshall testified to the new and improved plan before Congress, they approved it, and on April 3, 1948, the Foreign Assistance Act was signed by President Truman, and America was soon helping out its neighbors. Mr. Crawford's proposal was for the American businessmen to offer aid to their European counterparts in exchange for revenue and capital. One of the first companies to participate was the Ford Motor Company, which needed $2 billion more revenue to reach their yearly quota. The American government worked with the Ford Motor Company, and they reached an agreement that if Ford Motors supplied European motor industries with raw materials and technology, Ford Motors would then sell the $2 billion worth of stock to Europeans and the American government. American Coal partnered up with British Coal in the same scenario. American Coal shared technology with their European counterpart, and this time the British offered to import American coal into Europe at a discounted rate. These companies, with their counterparts overseas, were known as strategic partners, where one partner offered technology to the other, and both profited from the increase in earnings. This exchange between America and Europe solidified American imports, and made trade agreements between the two continents possible. The Marshall Plan was first implemented in the United Kingdom. The American government dispatched a committee to the United Kingdom to oversee the distribution of the Marshall Funds and the integration of American technology in the European industries. With the success in the United Kingdom, the Marshall Funds were transferred to France, Belgium, Holland, and the Scandinavian countries. Germany was always presented with funds. However, because of the settlement of the Yalta Conference in 1945, America was unable to aid Eastern Germany through the Soviet Union's occupied zone. The funds were divided out politically, socially, and economically. Some of the funds were used to recharge the political system in the countries that had near anarchy. Most of the money went to recharging the economic systems of the countries to ensure stability in the long run. Some money was, however, diverted to humanitarian needs such as water purification, food, shelter, and medicine, as most of the hospitals and markets were destroyed during the attacks. Helping Europe with Marshall Funds also helped their colonies. Nearly every country in Europe that received funds from America had colonies elsewhere, and helping the mother countries aided the colony. In Nairobi, Kenya, 40% of the male working population were unable to work because they were afflicted by blindness from the dreaded tsetse fly. Marshall funds that aided England went to Kenya and introduced new water purification methods, and with the rapid industrialization of the country, the swamplands that the tsetse fly calls home were quickly destroyed to make room for the farms. This diminished the tsetse fly's population and allowed the people of Nairobi peace at last. The Marshall Plan helped over 270 million people of 16 different nations in Western Europe that were reduced to hunger, homelessness, sickness, unemployment, and political restlessness. The Marshall Plan provided funds in three key areas: political, social, and of course economic. Crucial examples of distributed funds are the paying of freight subsidies for 16.8 million private voluntary relief packages to Europe, funds for building railroads and water systems in French North Africa, $50 million for medicine to combat the tuberculosis pandemic. The Ford Motor Company in Britain received funds to replace machine tools needed to produce cars, trucks, and tractors for export, thereby earning valuable foreign exchange credit. The Technical Assistance Program, which allowed over 3,000 Europeans to make 6-month visits to various U.S. industries to learn new techniques. There was also a similar program in agriculture. Naval insurance money enabled Portugal to purchase key equipment and materials to build a new hospital tender ship for its cod fishing fleet. Marshall funds aided the Berlin Airlift, which sustained Western Berlin's 2.5 million residents for over 11 months. Without the Marshall funds, the Allies would have been forced to concede Western Berlin to the Communists. Over its 4-year life, the Marshall Plan cost the United States 5 times the percent of national income as current foreign aid programs. That is a total cost of $13.3 billion. In today's market, it would have cost America over $120 billion to rescue Europe. This amount of money was gathered through the American taxpayer, who were more than willing to help their neighbor. The Marshall Plan had effects that lasted for decades, including the creation of the two most important international economic organizations, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. The IMF was developed to allow American businesses to exchange their European currency into American currency. It is now an organization with 184 member countries. The main goals of the IMF are to promote international monetary cooperation, exchange stability, and orderly exchange arrangements. The World Bank was created to regulate the vast amount of transactions between the two continents. The World Bank was also the organization that allocated the humanitarian packages from America. The World Bank's current mission is to fight poverty and improve the living standards of people in the developing world. Each of these organizations, plus many more, were created to regulate the exchange of money, capital, medicine, and any other foreign aid. Without the Marshall Plan, the current recovery program of Iraq would take years to implement, and during that time a resurgence could occur. The current program has cost $87 billion, and it too has American businesses exchange with Iraqi companies to foster growth and prosperity. The Marshall Plan, with the contributions of Malcolm Crawford, changed the policy and concept of foreign aid forever, and it is one of the most important documents of the 20th century.
They're really saying, I love you. I hear babies cry. I watch them grow. They learn much more than I ever knew. And I think to myself, what a wonderful